All right, and we are live.
Wonderful.
Okay. So first, just so I know, trying to think of where a good place to start. How did you get into like tabletop gaming in the first place?
Sure. So I guess we'll start with the actual beginning. My name is Strix, and I have been gaming for 15, 16 years now at least. I actually got into tabletop gaming the back way. I started freeform online text-based gaming when I was very young, 12 or 13, online, so in a digital space. And it was just pure storytelling. There were no dies, there was no random generators. That would come later in Mushes and Muds. But in the beginning, it was just, I'm going to type a piece of the story, and then you're going to type a piece of the story, and we'll have this sort of collaborative thing going on. And that was really great, and I wanted more of that. And I ended up getting into the physical tabletop space because of my experiences online.
Okay. So as you moved into kind of physical places, did you start to encounter any hostility or issues? Because
yes.
having been a guy gamer, I know that we can be hostile. So.
Well, especially when you're 15 or 14 years old. My very first tabletop gaming experience ever was actually really terrible. To this day, I sometimes wonder why I still participate in tabletop gaming because of that experience that I had, because it was just so negative. But I think a part of it is that, I was very young, and so was everyone else involved, and we weren't, very sophisticated thinkers yet. And I think as I've sophisticated as a thinker, I've gone, oh, that was really terrible. But at the time, I was a kid, and I wanted to fit in. This was the only option that I had, and I was the only girl. So there was just this big chemical mix of things that kept me from just leaving. But what happened was I got together with a bunch of guys who I considered to be my friends from school, and we played a game of either 3.0 D&D. Yeah, it was 3.0 or 3.5, one or the other. And of course I knew what D&D was because I was in nerd spaces even though I hadn't participated before. And I got the general gist of it. And I was actually really excited to play. I was like, oh, this is going to be a lot like what I do online. Yay. So we roll up our characters, and, one guy is a barbarian, and another guy is a ranger. And the first thing that happens is that they insist that I play a drow because I have brown skin. And that makes sense. And looking back at that now, obviously that's really not a great thing. But I was like, okay, drows are kind of awesome. They're a matriarchal society. They eat people. Like, why not? I can be a drow. That sounds cool. Not really understanding, a lot of the context of why this was even coming at me this way. The second thing that happened is they were like, you should play a sexy thief. And I was like, okay, what does the thief do? And they're like, she has 2 blades and she stabs things. And I was like, that sounds great. I love stabbing things. And so we began to play. And the very first thing that happened was that we walked into a dungeon. We were accosted by some sort of miasma or knockout gas. And my character woke up naked and alone in a cell without any of her equipment and no way out. And the entire point of that session was for the rest of the group to try to figure a way to get me out. And like, there was literally like actually no way for me to escape my prison on my own. And so this is a train wreck, right? And so, I'm like, okay, I don't know any better. Like, fine, whatever. This is kind of annoying. I'm not getting to do anything. I'm just sitting here. And then they come and they rescue me. And I'm like, that's great. Let's go kill some things with the daggers, right? That's what I signed up for. And we get maybe 3 or 4 more rooms in. And I shit you not, it happens again. In the same play session. Knocked out, stripped naked, no gear, stuck in a room with no doors, have to wait to be rescued. And that was my first tabletop gaming experience.
Wow, that's terrible.
And it's not uncommon. Not at all.
Okay, so, but you did stick with it. And I assumed that somewhere along the line you started having some good experiences.
I did. For me, I knew what I was after, and I was after novel storytelling experiences. So I was very interested in like D6 Star Wars. I loved Rifts. I did really like D&D. You know, Shadowrun was awesome. I loved these worlds. That's what I loved. I didn't so much love like being the only girl in a room and having to put up with like really weird behavior and not having the faculty to be able to deal with it well. That part I put up with to get the thing that I wanted. And it was only as I matured and became more sophisticated as an individual that I went, oh, I shouldn't have to put up with that stuff.
Okay. So when you first, your first tabletop game was D&D.
Mm-hmm.
When the other players pushed you into playing a drow because you had brown skin, did you look through the book at the art for the various characters? And if you did, what
Yes.
What impressions did those give you?
So art is actually very important to me. I'm one of those people who will pick up an RPG book, and if I don't like the art, I won't buy the book. I don't care how good the system is. I am all about imagery and world building, right? That's where my brain goes, and that's what I want when I'm playing. So art actually helps me decide if I'm going to fit in to a role or a character type or a class or whatever or not. So if I don't see something reflected in the art that I like or that I identify with, I'm just going to sail right by. So when I was looking in this D&D manual, I saw a lot of cool things. Some of them were less cool, but I gravitated towards, I cannot remember. There was some woman in armor, and I was like, she's really cool. Can I do that? And that's what I was aiming for. That's not obviously what I got, but I had it in my head, right? And it gave me sort of a target to focus on and aim for within the narrative and the fiction of the story. So to me, art is really, really integral to an RPG experience.
Okay. You said it gave you something to kind of aim for, and
Mm-hmm.
I like that imagery. When you've since picked up a lot of other games, obviously.
Yes.
What do you see in a game product art-wise that makes you excited to get into it and play it? And what
Mm-hmm.
would be something that you might see in a game material art-wise that might turn you off of the experience?
Yeah, so I think my taste, as well as everyone else's, is in a constant state of growth. If you had asked me that question even 2 years ago, my answer would have been different. But right now, what I really desire is the art to signify that the designers get it. And what I mean by that is, are women portrayed in a way that is not constantly sexualized? Like, is the art always from a sexualized male gaze, or is it not? Because I can tell immediately if it is or not. It's okay for women to be sexy, and it's also okay for women to wear chainmail bikinis, but that can't be the only thing that we ever see in art, right? If that's the status quo, then it's not actually for me, it's objectifying me, and I am not interested in that experience. I'm also interested in seeing races and classes being portrayed more complexly. So it's not just like good guys and bad guys, but like, hey, we're all people and we have different wants and desires, and this is what causes conflict. And you can absolutely communicate that through art. It's not that hard to show nuance, right? And then the third thing is that I just really like pretty things. If it is aesthetically pleasing, then I like it, and I am totally okay with that.
Okay. So on the same kind of visual impact topic, if you walk into a game store or a place where a gaming event is being held, not a convention right now, just a smaller event, what might you see in a space like that that would tell you that that would excite you to be there, and what might you see in a space like that that would warn you that you might have an unpleasant experience?
So I'll talk about game stores specifically, because I think game stores are really important to our hobby, and right now they're fairly regressive spaces. To a game store and immediately know if I'm going to have a hard time. It's really easy, because I will get something that I have termed internally as the nerd stare. And I am also a huge nerd, right? But I will walk into a game store and I can just feel like the chair swivel as a bunch of usually white cis male eyes turn and just sort of look at me. And it's, whatever. People always look to see who's coming in the door. But then I get this look that's like, what are you doing here? Like, I get looked at like I'm an alien, basically. And I am intruding on someone else's space. Even though it's totally my space too, and it always has been since I've been a kid. And almost every time that I've walked into a gaming store, I've gotten that nerd stare. And anytime that I have, I know that I'm going to have a hard time. That someone is going to try to explain to me what an RPG is, or they're going to assume that I'm there to look for my boyfriend, or that I am a fake nerd girl. Like, the list goes on. So I've become very sensitive to determining when a space is going to give me a hard time or not, because life is short and I don't have really time to put up with that. So I immediately look to see who is in a playing space. Are there women there? Are there people of color there? Are there LGBTQ people there? What kinds of games they are playing? Generally, if it's all, excuse the cat, if it's all battle games, I pretty much know I'm not going to fit in, right? Battle games aren't my thing. In general, there aren't a lot of women that play battle games. It's a really, what is the word that I'm looking for? Insular space. There's a lot of insular spaces in gaming. And I go, probably not for me. The other thing that I look at is the content of what's being sold on the shelves. Are there games like Night Witches or Monster Hearts, or even Pathfinder, right? Which is almost on every gaming store shelf. But also, like, what other kinds of games are there? Is there Star Trek? Is there Cards Against Humanity? And who is playing what? So it's really not hard for me to tell these days, like, if I'm going to have a bad time. And if I am, like, there's no reason for me to put up with that space anymore.
Okay. Now we'll kind of move on to conventions. What are there any signals that a convention can send either before or during the event that would say to you, this is going to be the kind of event that you want to attend? Or conversely, are there signals that they can send through their actions, through actual messaging, whatever, that they can send that would let you know that this isn't the kind of event you would want to attend?
Yeah, so I really like conventions. I go to a lot of conventions every year, up to 11 or 12 sometimes. So I'm very, very familiar with convention spaces. That being said, they are pretty fraught with a lot of sexual harassment issues and issues of representation. I won't name names, but some of the biggest conventions in our hobby, I go to them every year, and there's one where on the exhibit floor, I've never not been sexually harassed. So you say it and it sounds really dire and you feel overwhelmed and you're like, well, how is it that bad? I don't hear this. It's because we get tired of talking about it, right? And it's just sort of like, we all know how it goes, but maybe everyone else doesn't. So with convention spaces, I always look to see how sophisticated their harassment policy is, because that simply indicates, like, have they even thought about this? And then the second thing that I look at is, if they have a harassment policy, do they follow up? Because every convention will have things go wrong. Every convention will have incidents. It's just people. That's how people work. And so what is really telling is what the convention does about it. A good harassment policy is useless if it's not enforced, if people are afraid of actually holding up the boundaries that they establish. And so I guarantee at every convention, something's going to go wrong and someone's going to do something wrong. What does the staff do? And if they don't uphold those policies, then I know that they don't really mean it, or they haven't really arrived at a place where they know how or desire to enforce these cultural norms that they are trying to establish.
Okay. What sort of, now let's talk a little bit more directly about diversity,
Sure.
especially as it comes to visible markers of diversity like race and gender, in part because it's easiest to see when those aren't present.
Yeah.
What can can you describe your own experiences, what you've seen in the hobby, for instance, when you got started, and you mentioned being the only woman at your game table, to today?
So I feel like I have gotten really lucky in finding the indie tabletop community. Gaming aside, it's one of the most progressive sub-communities, at least in word, that I have encountered. And, you know, everyone's trying to figure out how to back it up with deed. I'm sure that because of the way that gaming works as a culture, with basically a bunch of little islands not talking to each other and everyone being really insular, that there are many, many other places that haven't seen as much progress. But for our little part of the world, I think things are going much better, and we're at least having these conversations. And a lot of times, you know, this stuff takes iteration. You're not going to go, oh, I need to do this thing, and then just fix it and you're done. You're going to go, oh, this is problematic. We should think about ways to fix this. Let's try this. That failed. Let's try this a different way. That failed. Let's combine the two. Okay, now maybe we have something. And I think what a lot of people in the gaming space are afraid of is failing when they should be thinking about iteration. I feel like white allies in particular feel that it's really risky to get things wrong, because if they get things wrong once, they're like X-nayed off the list or something. But that's not actually how progress works. Progress works because we at least try these things, we see where they don't work, and then we try again. So I think we're getting a little bit better at that, but I think we all have to work really hard to support each other in continuing the iteration and not just throwing our hands up and walking away.
Okay. What can an event space do to make itself more welcoming to people who might worry that the space is going to be hostile to them?
So there's actually a lot of things that event organizers can concretely do with a small amount of energy and a small amount of time and a small budget. A concrete thing that they could go and do tomorrow is look at their own power structure. Women and people of color know that if there are no women and people of color at the top, then how could their voices be heard, right? Someone is deciding things arbitrarily for them from a point of view that is not theirs. So I'm not talking about token minorities. I'm talking about someone with real agency and real power within an organization who is visible, who is signaling to people in the community and even outside the community, like, hey, I have a voice here. I have control here. I'm on the same page as you. We're working together. It's not a safe space because there's no such thing as safe spaces, but this is a safer space that we're working on. Will you come and join me? Rather than, hey, we're a bunch of white guys and you're a minority and we really want you to come in, but we don't really understand you, but try anyway and we'll kind of make it fit. That's not as appealing. I mean, it's great that people are trying, but you really need to show that you are willing to make these people leaders and not just part of your constituency. And that goes with hosting as well. So, you know, have women and minorities up front where people can see them, show that things are okay. And if they're not okay, they won't be around. So it's kind of a signal, right? That if you can't get them to hang around, there's some more things that you need to do. Obviously, the second thing is to have a a policy, and not just a harassment policy, but a community standards. You know, what is our culture? What is important to our culture, and what will we not abide? And then following that up with, hey, we're actually not going to abide this thing. I think as gamers, we have real challenges with saying no to bad actors, because a lot of us, including me, come from backgrounds where we were outsiders, and we're very sensitive to pushing other people towards the outside of our spaces. We want to accept everybody, we want to welcome everybody, but that's actually really harmful to people who are vulnerable because they don't have the power to say no and push those bad actors out. So when a bad actor is identified, you have to do the right thing and you have to push them out of the space. And that's really hard for some people to deal with. And I get it. It's complicated. You can get it wrong. But as long as we allow them to continue to operate in these spaces, the most vulnerable people will be the ones that are going to be the most affected, right? So you have to take that into account.
Okay. I know you mentioned that there's the one convention where you've been harassed every time you've gone on the floor. Do you have problems when you sit down to a table to actually play games at a convention?
Yes. I wish I had more positive things to say to you, John. But I actually almost exclusively do not play games at conventions with people that I do not know anymore. And that is because not once, not twice, but over and over again, when I sit down at convention tables with unknown quantities, with strangers, things can just get weird and get bad, and people say terrible things, racist things, sexist things. And a lot of us, I think, go through this thing where when one of these incidents happened, we're just so shocked. We're not prepared to do anything about it besides kind of sit there stunned and unable to sort of battle with it. There are so many social conventions that keep us in our chairs, right? That it's really hard to say, hey, stop that right now. That's really terrible, because there's 4 other people in the room and they're all like, well, there's nothing wrong with that, right? By the very point of them not saying anything before you say anything, you're like, oh, I'm the only one that's upset with this. And this is even in, fairly progressive gaming spaces that this has happened. So it's a really big challenge. And I don't know that my solution is the best solution because it's more insularness. But continuing to expose myself to gaming tables where I'm not having fun, because the whole point of gaming is fun, does not make sense to me anymore.
Okay. Now that we've talked a little bit about the community via game shops and conventions, let's talk a little bit about the gaming industry in as much as it's an industry.
Yeah.
We spent a little while earlier talking about products, but let's talk about the creators themselves.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of a difference do you see, or do you think that there is a difference when people from underrepresented or marginalized backgrounds are the ones making the products?
So this is kind of cheating because I am one of those people. But what I see is an opening up of almost like a treasure trove of vast and rich grounds of storytelling that we just haven't even tackled before. Which is really exciting to me as a person who loves storytelling, to get to explore new and different things. Diversity is only ever good for the gaming community in a lot of different ways, but in this particular aspect, it means that we have more power to tell more kinds of stories with more nuance that are going to show more people that they have a place at the table and that their story can be told. So, a perfect example is one of the games that I'm co-developing with Sarah Richardson and Marissa Kelly, Bluebeard's Bride, which is a feminine horror game in the tabletop space. As it turns out, it is the only feminine horror game in the tabletop space. As far as I know, and the research I've conducted, this has never really been done before. And I find that kind of ridiculous. Feminine horror is an amazing genre of horror. It's really interesting. It's really empowering, and it simply does not exist in our space yet. So I didn't set out to write this game because no one's ever done it before. I simply sat down and was like, what's interesting? What do I want to tell? And this is what came out authentically. And so I can only imagine all the other people who aren't game designers who have that same impetus, but don't actually have a way to get it out because there's no content that's going to address the stories that they want to tell. So we've seen a huge uptick, I think, in the indie space particularly, of games and game designers suddenly becoming conscious of this idea of diversity making games more awesome. And in the Kickstarter community specifically, they have the setup of stretch goal writers who write additional material for a base game. And we've really sort of exploited that space to tell a bunch of little pieces of different stories from different places where we wouldn't normally see them as a collective. And that has been really cool.
Okay. One of the challenges facing people from historically marginalized communities is that they don't have the resources that people like myself tend to have, which is some combination of connections, access to money, access to skills. How can that transfer be made easy to make sure that the people with these new ideas, with these different experiences, have the resources to actually make a game in the first place, or even have the get them the awareness that they can be the one making a game. They don't have to wait for someone else to make a game.
Yeah. So I can only speak from personal experience here in that I had to be dragged to it. There are many people that I'm thankful towards who were like, Strix, you need to write. And I was like, that's nice. Not really. Even though I really wanted to, I didn't feel like that I could or that I had permission. So I think mentorship here is really key. If you are a person who has privilege or power or have gained respect over the years, the best thing that you can do is personally connect with and mentor people from minority backgrounds who want to do what you're doing. And that takes effort, and that takes time, right? There's no easy ways out. The second thing that you can do if you're a gaming studio or a game designer looking to hire out work is change your hiring practices. And understand that an open call to minorities to come join your stuff is probably not actually going to work. What you need to understand is that minority writers start way behind the start line, right? Which means that by the time they get to you and they want to write for you, maybe their skills aren't as polished. Maybe they have a lot of things to learn. And so part of taking that on is taking on that understanding and knowing that you're going to have to address those needs, and that it's going to take some additional work to maybe get them to where you want them, but that is actually what it takes to make them successful writers in the gaming space. And so those resources are necessary to their success, to my success. If people hadn't gone out of their way to help me develop while I was writing the assignments they were paying for, it never would have happened. And now I do a bunch of writing for both analog and video games. I'm becoming more successful, but that is only because other people put resources into me, right? You can't get resources out unless you're willing to put resources in.
Okay. You mentioned open call. I've seen several of them kind of go around the community, and that they have.
They don't work.
Right. They don't. So what might work as a way to find the talent that you want to find?
I will absolutely tell you what works. Direct invitation. Direct, sustained, and repeated invitation. You really have to go out of your way if you want to make this work. And by what I mean by direct invitation is, that a woman writer of color has been thinking about wanting to write for games, but they don't know how, and they don't know who to talk to, and they're not sure if they're good enough. You need to personally go to that person, write them an email, or talk to them on Skype, or see them at convention and say, hey, I would like you to write for me. And then they're gonna go, no, I can't. Because that's exactly what I did. And then you have to go, no, I would really like you to write for me. And this may go back and forth a couple of times. But eventually, you'll finally convince them that you actually want them, because what's going on is they're thinking, what I was thinking, is that like, well, you don't really want me to write for you. No one's ever really wanted me to write for them. This is not true. This is scary and false, and you're probably setting me up to fail. I don't want to do it because it's not safe. And so it's not that they don't want to write for you, is that they're not sure that it's going to work out. Like you really want them to. You may say it, but is it something else that's going on? So it's you have to build trust, essentially, and you have to build conviction.
Okay. I had a follow-up. Let me see if I can retrieve it. I think it's gone.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. Totally blanked. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about communities, products, conventions, and how to get more people into the actual industry,
Mm-hmm.
and more people into the role of creator in various creative roles. Now that you've been working as a creator, have you experienced any pushback from other people when you tell them that you're a creator?
So I'll tell you a funny gaming story, and then I'll talk about this question seriously. So I was looking for a new gaming group in my old city. I just moved to a new city. And I went to a meetup at a game store, and I walked in, and it was, of course, a bunch of guys, and I was the only woman. And this is in like a really diverse, very sophisticated, large city of over 3 million people. And they're like, hey, and I'm like, hey, I'm here for the gaming. And they're like, cool, well, we're doing some indie games today. I don't know if you've heard of those. And I'm like, yeah, no, I've heard of indie games. And they're like, cool, well, we're gonna play a game today called Urban Shadows. And this game is powered by the apocalypse. And that means that there's this game by Vincent Baker. And I'm like, guys, I wrote for Urban Shadows. And just like the looks on their faces, they were just like, they gave me the alien look again. And I was like, okay, this is gonna go really well. So the point of that story is that even as a writer, my cred is constantly checked because people just assume that I'm not one because of how I look and how I talk and how I present myself. Inside of the indie gaming community itself, there's been tons of support. The support actually has been really great. The indie community has helped foster my creativity in a way that it would have never taken off without them. So I'm very, very grateful. Outside of the indie tabletop community, things are interesting. Gamergate is still a really big issue. And it is not particularly safe to be a woman of color who's designing a feminine horror game. Like, I almost kind of wait for the day where they get wind of this and they come at me, bro. Because it's not something that these guys would like. But so far, things have been okay. I did write an article for Tor a while ago about diversity in tabletop gaming and specifically about minority settings and how they're awesome. And it was a really positive article, and there was like no pointing fingers at anyone. And of course, the comment section was like, there are lots of people who went in there and said really great things, but there are also the ones that are like, we don't need diversity, blah, 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 blah. So that can be a little invalidating in that there are people that don't see this need that I feel like is really dire, like it's a dire need, and they're like, it's not a thing. Why are you so upset? And I'm like, well, because of all of these things, and the conversation just doesn't happen. So I'm not really tied into the traditional trad space a lot anymore, but I have a feeling that if I was, I'd probably get a little more pushback there than I do from the indie community.
Okay. Can you take a few moments to talk about your academic background and how that might, how you might relate that to some of the work you're doing?
Definitely. My academic background is kind of integral to how I understand games. So I have a master's degree in mythological studies, and I study the intersection between mythology and narrative games, so digital and analog. But a lot of my research has been around LARP, specifically because LARP has this really interesting aspect of being embodied. Your body is actually moving and acting, and that changes how your brain actually interacts with the fictions that you're making. So I've done work with Carnegie Mellon. I've done presentations in Germany. I've done work at Pacific Graduate Institute, all on this idea of narrative storytelling and archetype, mythological archetype, and psychology. So I posit quite often, you know, RPGs are almost like a secularized version of the mythologies that we told ourselves sort of pre-modernity. So myth has always been a part of the human experience. You know, half of our brain is non-rational, not irrational, non-rational. And non-rationality is actually a really important part of our decision-making engine and understanding the world. Because if we were totally logical, we would be really scary creatures. But what myth does is it lets us explore ourselves and who we are and what that means through metaphor or through archetypal structures. So even just looking at games like D&D, where you play literally archetypes, right? The ranger, the barbarian, the wizard. These are very heavily laden ideas that go back centuries and centuries with human thought. And when we engage an archetype, we are engaging actually a part of ourselves. And when we play around with what that means, we gain a deeper understanding, which is always great. So this is where I fly off on my academic tangent and I say, you know, it's actually really important that we do these things as a culture.
Okay, follow up to that actually. So for a game like Night Witches, where all of the players must play Soviet women pilots,
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that has an impact on players like me who might play that game who have no idea what any part of that experience is like?
Well, you tell me. Have you played Night Witches?
I've not had the opportunity. I own the book, haven't had people to sit down and play with yet.
Uh-huh. So I think games like Night Witches are important. And that is because basically my whole life, I've had to fit myself into the white male narrative and see myself within that. So to flip that around and to make a white male see themselves in a Soviet woman narrative, I think is a good exercise for everybody. There are things, particularly about the feminine perspective, that you're not going to get unless you try to engage it directly, until you try to embody it. And I think the key to games like that is actually in the design, right? You could design this game really well so that it delivers that experience in a genuine and authentic way, or you could not design it well and it could just be about all kinds of other things that aren't really based on this experience that you're aiming for. So I think this is where design becomes really important, and understanding its place in these contexts is also really important. If you want to communicate an idea or express a way of being, then it has to be baked into your game from the ground up. It can't just be like a wall of text at the front of your first page where it says, women in Soviet Russia do all these things and think all these things. You have to drive players to arrive there themselves.
Okay, and that brings us back to one of the places we started, which is about having people from these different backgrounds actually designing games and hopefully being able to do so in an authentic way. So now that we've sort of brought this full circle, I'm going to go ahead and thank you for your time very much, and have a great evening.
All right, you too.